Well, all eyes were on Charles as he was crowned king, an historic moment more than 70 years in the making.
The world watched and the royals certainly didn't disappoint. To talk us through the highlights, we're joined now by royal historian Robert Lacey in London. Robert, good morning. Thanks for your time. How would you describe the events that you saw in London yesterday?
Well, historic in lots of ways. What struck me, having lived now for 70 years with our Sphinx-like Queen Elizabeth II, was the way in which we saw the emotions of Charles. I mean, a lot of people here are finding more time for King Charles III than they had for Prince Charles. And one of the reasons for that is that he does communicate emotion. He's done that very well with his early speeches. But today, he looked worried. He looked anxious. He looked sort of miserable down in the dumps, certainly at the beginning. I mean, and the stress of it was clearly getting to him. And then as the ceremony went on, and you saw the clothes put on him, and then finally the crown put on his head, you could actually see him develop in stature, and he really did emerge as a king. And then, of course, beside him, there's Camilla, the first royal mistress to be crowned a queen since Anne Boleyn. Well, that's been a soap opera that's lasted 20, 30 years, and it was her moment of triumph.
I mean, watching from abroad, it seems so decadent, so opulent, and yet we're told this is scaled back compared to what it was for Queen Elizabeth II. It was clearly, though, an incredibly expensive occasion.
Yes, it was. I mean, the estimates, it's estimated that it was 3 or 4 times more than Queen Elizabeth II's in terms of inflation-adjusted expense. But the big difference, of course, sadly, was the extra security that you need in these days of possible terrorist attack, climate protesters. There were anti-monarchist protesters who were led away. And the other thing I would say in defense of what we saw, I mean, they only happen, well, this one is 70 years since the last one. The expense of the coronation is rather comparable to the inauguration of the president in America. Same sort of sum, $100 million, $150 million. And they have one every 4 years. Since our last coronation, they've had 11 or 12 inaugurations. We've just had one. So I think a lot of people here think actually it's not bad value for money.
So what about when it comes to leadership and King Charles? What sort of mark do you expect him to make on the monarchy? A more thoughtful mark. Again, it's so difficult to make these comments without appearing to criticise his predecessor, but that's the way it is. One of the appeals of the monarchy is the way in which you get a new personality, and you like them or you not, but it's something you think about. What's interesting is that we've got a big sort of pop star party tomorrow that nobody wanted to take part in. Even old Uncle Elton John didn't want to take part. We had to bring in Lionel Richie, I think. What he's got to do with the British monarchy, I don't know. But anyway, but the point I'd like to make is that on Monday we have our normal holiday, coronation, royal bank holiday. But Prince Charles has asked that it should be called the Big Help Out. The idea is that we don't just sit back and drink beer. We should try and find somebody in our community who's feeling lonely and just go and spend some time with them. Now, that shows the sort of thought that 74 years has brought into this man's brain. He thinks he's got to try and make a difference, and he'd like us to try and make a difference as well.
Speaking of the spectacle of the whole thing, Robert, what do you think was the highlight of the coronation for you?
Well, for me, it's all those marching troops. I mean, it's, I'm not a militarist. I never did my national service. But, I mean, as someone said, it's the sort of thing that the Brits overdo so well. It's interesting that in Europe, we've got a dozen monarchies in what I think of as the intelligent countries, like Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the social democratic
progressive countries. It's very interesting, and Australians might care to reflect on this. All these very modern, progressive, social democratic countries have chosen to keep a constitutional monarchy because they like the idea of a figurehead above politics. And so that's a sort of reflection I think that people are coming to. You know, in Ireland, we have a very similar constitution to ours, except that every 7 years in Ireland, they elect a head of state, a non-political head of state. And the advantage of that is that you don't just get to choose someone quite interesting. The Irish have produced some very interesting presidents. You get to debate every 7 years, what does this country stand for? Prince Charles, now King Charles, says he wants it to stand for a society that tries to make a difference. And so that's what I think is going to be the theme of the months ahead.
Royal historian Robert Lacey, thank you so much for your insight this morning.
Well, if there's one thing the coronation did prove, it's that God really is in the detail, and nobody has an eye for detail quite like royal historian Dr. Tessa Dunlop, who's live for us in London this morning. Tessa, let's talk about the crowns. Charles wore two, the St Edward's crown for the ceremony and then the imperial state crown for the procession. Talk us through the significance of that.
It's interesting. One of Charles's, good morning, by the way, Australia. Well, I faked Buckingham Palace, as you can see. I was where Robert was earlier, but very sadly, I'm on crutches. So it took me a while to get home. I don't know if you can see them. So I left it. I know, half a mile from Green Park down to the palace. I needed Camilla's carriage, but carriage is in a minute. Let's talk about the crowns.
Yes.
One of Charles's earliest memories was going into his mother's office and seeing her sitting there with the St Edward's crown on her head. And she was practicing because it's so heavy. And I actually thought it was this wonderful symbol that his mother was first in many ways the institution and second the mother. So it's no mean feat that he wore that crown. I'm telling you what, the likes of Edward VII reneged on wearing it. It's a heavy crown for a man of his age. And as Robert alluded to there, he did look like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders and his head at some points in the ceremony. And I did think back to his mother, actually, and people always talked, and I know because I've worked with veterans who were there and who remembered the coronation all those years ago, and they always reflected on her vulnerability because she was so young, and they prayed for her that night, their queen, first in the St Edward's crown, then in this imperial crown, the second crown. But actually, I thought Charles, weighed down not just by the crown, but this extraordinary period of waiting, was more vulnerable than his mother. Somehow there's a vulnerability in age, isn't there? You know, you feel like you're invincible when you're young, you're immortal, you take your generation with you. But Charles knows actually what confronts him is far more complex prospect than what confronted his mother, the last generation that believed in marriage wholeheartedly, that believed in monarchy. Back then, 74 years ago, 34% of Britons believed there was some special relationship between God and the monarchy. I think most of us now don't even believe in God, let alone in a special relationship between God and the monarchy. So what he was trying to pull off in there with the help of this staggering crown was pretty challenging. As for his consort, or queen as she's now in some quarters controversially considered being called, the St Mary's crown, modified, of course, the Koh-i-Noor diamond had been removed from it. You can still visit that in the Tower of London, by the way, but it now has a disclaimer, a label saying the heritage of this jewel is controversial. Quite whether that will ever be restituted is another question. There were, of course, the Cullinan diamonds in this St Mary's crown, which again are slightly contested. A lot of people have been very worried about that, but I do think all countries, including your own, of course, Australia, we have a way of reflecting on our history, and that's what monarchy and coronations do. And not all that history is comfortable, and a lot of it is. And I think monarchy today, in today's Britain, it's a reminder of that. It's a reminder that some bits are uncomfortable, some bits are comfortable. And that is your national baggage. And thus we carry it forward with Charles as the new face.
Well, we do hear a lot about how Charles wants to modernise the monarchy and bring it into the present world. But when we watched that ceremony last night for us, I mean, there wasn't all that much that seemed very modern about it. We're talking about orbs and sceptres and robes. How modern can the monarchy get?
Indeed, and actually the most challenging thing for Charles, and I've just alluded to it, is his age and stage. His mother didn't have to try and modernise because she was this extraordinary symbol of then contemporary Britain. It was pretty revolutionary to have a head of state who was this young, blemish-free woman. And in fact, she was an ideal prism through which to cast the Commonwealth and also the other realms, including Australia. She then sets off on this tour, including to Australia. 1/3 of your country go out to meet the Queen. It's inconceivable when Charles, I believe he's planning to come to Australia in 2024, if you desire to have the King visit. It's inconceivable 1/3 of your country would turn out to visit him now. So we live in very different times. And how can you be modern if you're a white privileged man, age 74? So, and also if you're head of a very traditional institution. And I think that's one of the reasons why questions are being asked. I, for one, just on a personal note, because I think he has been through the mill emotionally. I was just glad Harry was there and looked relaxed and there was no kind of scandal. There was nothing the tabloids could dig up and make ugly. It was pretty smooth in that respect.
You're right, Tessa. Thank you so much for your insight this morning. We appreciate you joining us on Weekend Today. And Tessa's book, Elizabeth and Philip, A Story of Young Love, Marriage and Monarchy, is available at all good bookstores.
Hey there, Today fans. Sarah and...
What's my name again?
Oh my God, Carl.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel, though. Subscribe now for more news, special reports and amazing Aussie stories.
And Carl misbehaving,
Whoa,
of course.
that never happens.
Always happens.
What's she talking about?